It's been a while since I made a Star Rail video, and honestly, I knew this was one I was eventually going to have to make, even if I also knew some people weren't going to be happy with it. Because this video is about the latest Star Rail story update, the Finality mission, the return to Penacony, and I was deeply disappointed by it. Not in a "this didn't go where I wanted to go" way, but in a much more frustrating way because of what the story promised and then never actually followed through on. I know some people already tune out the moment I talk about Star Rail like this. I've seen the comments before that this is all subjective, that it's just personal taste, that I'm being unfair. So let me be clear about what this video is and what it isn't. This is not me nitpicking individual scenes. This is me looking at the Finality mission as a piece of storytelling, using the same narrative principles I've been learning and engaging with for years, not just from playing games but from reading, from studying story structure, and from listening to authors, editors, and people who actually do this professionally. You don't have to agree with my conclusion, but what I want to talk about here isn't coming from nowhere. Because the problem with this update isn't just that it didn't work for me, it's that it sets up a story about the protagonist, about memory, identity, and agency, and then refuses to actually tell that story. And that's where things start to fall apart. Let's start with how this story frames itself at the very beginning, and the expectations it sets. The problem with this update starts almost immediately, and ironically it starts strong. The Finality mission opens by telling you exactly what this is supposed to be about. Lost memories, altered perception, the protagonist being unable to trust what they remember or why. We're introduced to Dahlia, a character whose entire role is tied to manipulating memories. She interferes with people's recollections, reshapes events, reframes reality, and crucially, the protagonist doesn't fall for it. They resist the manipulation, they notice something is wrong. For a brief moment, it feels like the story is finally positioning the protagonist as an active presence rather than just a camera moving through events. And at that point, I genuinely thought, okay, this is interesting. And I want to quote J Daddy here, this is what I'm looking for, some main character shit. Because Star Rail has always struggled to make the protagonist feel like an actual protagonist. So the idea of a story centered on their memories, their perception, and their agency felt like a real opportunity. But that opportunity is never taken. Because almost immediately the story stops being about the protagonist's memories and starts showing us scenes they were never present for in the first place. Entire sequences play out without the protagonist involved at all, moments they didn't witness, events they had no way of experiencing. Which raises a very simple question the story never answers. How can these be their lost memories if they weren't there? At that point, the framing completely collapses. What we're actually watching isn't the protagonist uncovering buried memories, it's the story replaying Penacony from different angles, while still insisting that this is somehow a deeply personal journey for the player character, and that disconnect never goes away. The update keeps saying that this is about the protagonist, but it never structures itself like it is. The protagonist doesn't drive the revelations, they don't uncover the truth through actions or choice. They're just present while information happens around them. So right from the beginning, there's a gap between what the story claims to be doing and what it's actually doing. And once that trust is broken, everything that follows becomes harder to take seriously. Especially when the story then asks you to sit through hours of exposition built on that broken premise. Once the story loses its footing on what it's actually about, another problem becomes impossible to ignore. Just how much of this update is telling instead of showing. This mission is long, and not long because a lot happens, long because a lot is explained. Characters spend an enormous amount of time describing events, emotions, motivations, and ideas that the story rarely lets you experience directly. Instead of scenes unfolding through action, we're constantly being told what something means, why it matters, and how we should feel about it. And normally that's something you could at least mitigate by pacing yourself, but Star Wars doesn't let you do that. The game presents its story in an almost visual novel-like format. Slow camera pans, character animations, pauses between lines, but it doesn't give you the freedom to advance at your own reading speed. You're forced to wait. You wait for character to finish an animation, you wait for the pause to end, you wait for the dialogue box to unlock, and when the content you're waiting for is already heavy on exposition, that enforced pacing turns from cinematic to exhausting. I actually had to stop partway through this update when it first released, not because I didn't understand what was happening, but because I just couldn't sit through it anymore. The story wasn't engaging me, it was wearing me down. And that's when it really clicked for me just how fragile this kind of storytelling is. If you're going to rely heavily on telling instead of showing, you cannot afford to slow the player down, because once the pacing is forced, every weakness in the writing becomes more visible. The repetition, the over-explanation, the lack of momentum, it starts to feel less like you're uncovering a mystery and more like you're being walked through a summary, one you're not allowed to skim. And this isn't just a matter of personal preference, it's a structural issue. Long-form storytelling works when scenes do the work, when meaning emerges from conflict, choice, and consequence, when characters act and the audience draw conclusions. Here, the story often skips that process entirely. It explains first and expects the explanation to carry the emotional weight on its own, which makes the length feel unjustified and the experience increasingly frustrating, especially when you realize just how little of this is actually advancing the protagonist's role in the story. And that's where the next issue comes in, because even after all this build-up, the central twist the update hinges on isn't new at all. After all that build-up, all that exposition, all that time spent reframing Penacony, the update hinges on a reveal that's supposed to recontextualize everything. The problem is, we've already been here. Penacony's original story already revolved around altered perception, already used memory manipulation as its central trick, already ended on the idea that what we experienced wasn't entirely real, that we were caught in someone else's construction and only realized it at the very end. That was the twist. So when the Finality mission positions itself as another revelation built around memory being unreliable, it immediately runs into the problem of diminishing returns. Yes, the details are different, yes, the mechanics aren't exactly the same, but thematically, emotionally, and structurally, it's hitting the same beat again. Once more, the story tells you, what you thought you knew isn't true, what you experienced wasn't complete, there's another layer beneath it all. And the issue isn't that this kind of twist can only ever be used once, it's that if you're going to reuse it, the second time needs to do something fundamentally different. It needs to challenge different assumptions, it needs to reframe the story in a way that couldn't have been achieved before. But here, it doesn't. Instead, it feels like the story is looping back to a familiar tool because it worked once, not because it's the best way to tell this particular story. And that's where the emotional impact starts to flatten, because once the audience recognizes the pattern, the revelation loses its ability to surprise. The mystery becomes procedural. You stop wondering what's really happening and start waiting for the next explanation. And that's especially damaging in a story that's already leaning heavily on telling instead of showing. At that point, the twist doesn't feel like a discovery, it feels like a delayed clarification, which makes all the build-up feel heavier than it needed to be, and all the narrative weight harder to justify. And that leads directly into the final problem, because after all this reframing, all this reinterpretation, the story still has to answer a very basic question. What actually changes because of this? After all the time spent revisiting Penacony from different angles, the story reaches its conclusion. And this is where the Finality missions ultimately collapses under its own weight, because for something positioned as a deeper truth, an alternate understanding of what really happened, the ending doesn't actually changes very much. Yes, there are differences. Firefly's story gains more context, we learn about her so-called third death, Dahlia is introduced as a new presence in the narrative, but when you step back and look at the broader picture, the outcome is almost the same. Penacony ends in roughly the same place, the world state is unchanged, the core cast is intact, the emotional resolution lands in nearly the same spot it did before, so you're left asking a very simple question. What was the point of going through all of this? Because this wasn't a short epilogue, it wasn't a quick clarification, it was a long demanding story segment that asked for hours of attention, and in return it offers adjustments, not transformation. Firefly's arc becomes more detailed, but not fundamentally different. The ending is reframed but not redefined, the truth is expanded but not reshaped, which makes the entire experience feel disproportionate. The time invested suggests a meaningful divergence, the framing suggests a revelation, but the result feels closer to a revision than a resolution. And that's where the disappointment really settles in. Not because nothing good is added, but because nothing added feels necessary enough to justify how much the story asks of the player. When an ending doesn't meaningfully alter the story trajectory, the weight of everything that leads up to it starts to feel artificial. And that's especially frustrating here because the update wasn't positioned as optional flavor, it was framed as finality, as the place where things finally come together. Instead, it leaves you with a sense that you've walked a very long road, only to arrive somewhere you'd already been. After sitting with all of this, what frustrates me the most isn't any single scene or twist or writing choice. It's the growing feeling that the story doesn't really know what it's trying to do anymore. Not in the sense that it's confused, but in a sense that it feels safe, repetitive, and willing to commit to anything that might actually move the narrative forward in a meaningful way. And that's especially disappointing, because Starville has without question one of my favorite settings in the entire gacha genre. The universe, the tone, the sci-fi concepts, the potential for long-form character-driven storytelling, all of that is there, which is why it hurts so much to watch the story keep circling the same ideas without ever fully capitalizing on them. The Finality mission feels like a symptom of that problem, a story that gestures towards depth, towards introspection, towards protagonist agency, and then pulls back before doing anything truly uncomfortable or transformative. And at that point, it's hard not to ask whatever the writers are even trying to tell something great, or if they're just trying to maintain momentum. Because ambition without follow-through eventually starts to feel hollow. I'll be honest, I'm closer than I've ever been to putting Starville down for good. Not because I hate it, but because disappointment is harder to carry than frustration. At the same time, the setting still means enough to me that I want to give it one last chance. I want to see what the next big arc does. Even knowing that it was rushed, even knowing that it replaced something they originally planned but couldn't tell. I don't have high expectations anymore. I don't even have moderate ones. Just a very small sliver of hope that maybe, somehow the story will finally decide to commit to the potential it's been sitting on for so long. Because if it doesn't, then this update might not just be a misstep, it might be a turning point. If you made it this far, thanks for listening. I know this isn't a take everyone is going to agree with, and that's fine. I'm not trying to convince anyone to feel the same way I do. All I wanted to do here was talk honestly about why this update didn't work for me and why that disappointment feels heavier than usual. If you enjoyed the discussion, feel free to like the video or subscribe if you want to see more long-form story analysis like this. And if you disagree, genuinely, I'm interested to hear why. Just keep it civil. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.